Spring comes to the north field in a clean line, the snow sinking into dark soil while Abel Walton moves with a carpenter's steady hands and a farmer's quiet smile. He marks the ground with a string and a chalked stick as if laying out a floor, measuring the earth in equal squares, pausing often to look up at the sky the way a man checks a ceiling for plumb. He tells a neighbor the holes will be root cellars, small and neat, just enough for potatoes and carrots, and the neighbor accepts the answer because Abel has straight fences, pays his tithes, and never raises his voice. Wooden stakes go in at the corners, each shaved smooth, each labeled with a tiny figure that looks like a number and a moon. The grid spreads across the field until it resembles a calendar drawn with patience. 12 spaces set in 3 tidy rows, a season planned in wood and chalk and quiet breath. He works without hurry, stopping only to wipe the blade with linen that smells of egg and ash, smoothing it as if pressing a wrinkle from a child's shirt. The ground yields easy, spring soft and damp, and the holes deepen shoulder by shoulder until a man could stand in one and feel the field sound dim around him. Abel measures depth by the span of his arm and the length from wrist to elbow, like a coffin maker who does not say the word coffin. He sets planks to hold the walls, tapping them in place with the handle of the spade to keep the noise polite. Light moves across the parlor like a clock he reads from the field, and when it strikes the middle window he counts under his breath. He likes that phrase because it makes order sound like love. Mercy Walton watches from the kitchen door, her apron white, her face still, one hand at her throat where a ribbon sits like a second mouth pressed shut. She keeps a small ledger for chores and blessings. On the back pages are circles and dates no one else minds. And he sometimes glances at it like a measuring stick. Abel's eyes are gentle when he looks at people and colder when he looks at plans. He believes a home is a body and must have bones that do not shift. And he loves the look of straight lines the way some men love music. Neighbors know the surface of him. The Sunday coat, the careful hat, the unhurried voice. But the field knows the part that wants the world to stop wobbling. He tells himself good things grow when the soil is taught a shape, and he presses each rim with his palm, leaving prints that dry darker than the rest. A hawk circles and the wind makes the stakes click like teeth. Abel smiles because wind can be trained to pass without trouble if the path is clear. When the 12th hole meets his mark, he draws a final square on a scrap of paper, a grid that mirrors the land and writes ready in tiny letters. He closes his eyes as if saying grace and sees the earth as a room with 12 beds and no windows. He tells himself it is only storage, the future kept in the ground where mice can't reach and rot can't hurry. But the smile that rests on his mouth is not relief. It is the calm of a man who has arranged a puzzle so there is only one way to move. He cleans the spade with linen that smells like egg and ash, folds it small, and brings the stakes into line as the light leaves the window. The field waits, the calendar waits, and the house behind him waits too, with a ribboned book and a page that will soon ask for a first mark. Mercy Walton moves quietly through the house, her footsteps soft enough to be mistaken for the creak of wood or the shift of wind at the eaves. She is known as a careful wife, a woman who counts eggs by touch and measures flour by the slope of her palm. Her book lies always near the hearth, a ledger wrapped in cloth where she writes the rhythm of each day. Sweeping, mending, prayers, blessings. Neighbors say she is the balance to Abel's stern lines that her calm hand makes the house gentle. They never see the back pages. There the writing changes. Circles are drawn in neat ink, each one tied to the sky, each one marked with a single word. Ready. Sometimes she writes it twice, pressing hard until the paper shines with the groove. To her it is not only a word but a measure, proof that the house is orderly, that no thread lies loose, that nothing wanders from the plan. When Abel lines the holes in the north field with planks, Mercy watches with that same calm. She carries water and bread to him as any wife would, but she also notes the days in her book with circles that match the sky overhead. The moon wanes, she writes. The field waits. Her neighbors see her at church and smile at her quiet nod, at the way her hands fold like she is always in prayer. They do not see the smudges on her fingertips from ash and resin, or the way she studies the patterns of weather like a child studies scripture. Abel tells them the holes are for roots, for storage, and she echoes him with the same soft certainty, her voice too steady to doubt. They believe her, because Mercy has never given reason not to. At night by firelight she matches the ledger to Abel's grid. Each hole marked with a stake, each stake marked with a symbol, each symbol mirrored by her circle. She presses the book closed with both hands, as if sealing it shut keeps the plan safe inside. When she turns the page, she does it slowly, her breath even, her face without shadow. To her, the counting is not madness but devotion. She believes care is proven not by words but by order. If children are to be safe, they must be measured, weighed, and recorded the way one records grain or wool. The field is a ledger, too, waiting to be filled. Mercy moves through her days with the grace of habit, her apron always clean, her hair pinned with no loose strands. She gives neighbors bread, lends needles, sings hymns with a voice just above a whisper. They call her a blessing, a quiet example of a good wife. She smiles when they say it, the corners of her mouth soft, her eyes down. Inwardly, she thinks of the word ready, written in her book, and how good it feels to know nothing is left to chance. She tells herself the world is unruly, that storms and sickness and hunger tear through those who are unprepared. But here in her ledger, nothing strays. In the field, the holes are lined smooth, each plank measured and set. She watches Abel hammer the wood into place and thinks of the word again. Ready. She writes it once more that evening, tracing it darker than before. She feels no fear, only a calm certainty that the ground now matches the page. To her, it is proof that the house is righteous, that order is a form of care, that what is written cannot be erased. The neighbors see nothing unusual. They see Mercy Walton, the good wife who counts blessings. They do not see that she is also counting something else. Clara Walton is 16 and already carries herself like a woman twice her age. Quiet in the way of her mother, careful in the way of her father. She sits at the small desk near the window where light falls straight, her pen sharp, her lines steady. The ledger before her is not a diary of feelings but a record of order. She copies the marks Mercy keeps in the household book, making her own account of circles tied to the moon, notes on church visits, and the words her mother whispers without pause. Breath lessons. Clara writes them in a neat column, the ink unbroken, the dates exact. She likes that the page looks clean, that it matches what her father makes in the field, square for square, hole for hole. She believes records are what keep the world from slipping apart. When the book is closed, she keeps another box by her side. Inside are scraps of linen, each cut to the shape of a face, some stiff, some soft, each one labeled in her careful hand. She writes names or initials, sometimes just a mark. She measures them against her brothers and sisters, against herself, even against the round curve of a doll's cheek. She calls them angel masks. To anyone else, they are only strips of cloth, but to Clara, they are proof that each face can be captured, that each breath can be trained. The masks are dipped in a mixture she prepares in secret, the same one Mercy showed her. Egg white for binding, salt for purity, ash for cleansing. When pressed against skin, The linen hardens slowly, shaping itself until it feels like a shell, sealing the mouth, quieting the noise of breath. Clara does not flinch at the thought. She smooths the cloth with gentle hands, as if tucking a child into bed, watching the fibers stiffen as though the soul is being measured in silence. She believes this is not cruelty but care. Mercy has taught her that the body must be stilled if the spirit is to remain clean, and Abel has shown her that order is stronger than chaos. Clara is both their daughter and their disciple, her pen strokes as important as their shovels and planks. Neighbors who see her in town think her shy, her eyes always lowered, her hands folded. They imagine a girl who reads hymns and tends to mending. They never imagine the box of linen at her bedside, the one she opens at night when the house grows quiet. She lifts each piece, runs her fingers across its surface, remembers who it fits. Some are smaller, barely enough to cover a child's mouth, others broader, meant for older faces. Each mask feels like a chapter in a book only she and her mother can read. She has begun to number them in her ledger, too, a hidden column she writes when no one watches. She likes that the pages match. The circles of mercy, the squares of Abel, and her own tally of masks. Together they form a system she trusts more than any sermon. When the wind rattles the shutters, Clara looks up from her writing and feels calm because she knows nothing has been left unmarked. In her mind, the family is safer this way, their lives bound to rules that no storm or sickness can scatter. She does not think of the faces beneath the linen as suffering. She thinks of them as preserved, sealed in silence, as if each one is a prayer held in her hand. To her, the mask is not a weapon, but a blessing. She whispers the name Angel Mask each time she files one away, her voice soft enough that even Mercy in the next room does not hear. The ledger closes with a snap, the box with a click, and Clara folds her hands like the obedient daughter everyone believes her to be. The house sleeps, but her marks remain, quiet proof that the plan continues line by line, mask by mask, ready for what comes next. Ruth Carver had walked the back roads of Illinois for years, delivering babies in one-room cabins, binding wounds and sitting at bedsides where fever carried more than prayer could cure. She was known as steady, discreet, a woman who kept her hands clean and her words measured. So when Mercy Walton asked her to sit with a fever, Ruth did not hesitate. She tied her bonnet, gathered her satchel of herbs and cloth, and stepped across the Walton threshold, believing she would find the same simple sickness she had seen 100 times before. What she found instead left her unsettled in a way no birth or death ever had. The parlor was neat, the hearth swept, and yet the air carried a weight that pressed too close. Against the wall stood a frame fitted with a foot treadle bellows, the kind usually kept in a smithy, but here rigged with copper valves and pipes that led nowhere Ruth could see. At first she thought it was some tool Abel had made for carpentry. Then she noticed the shallow tin beneath it, dark with resin drips, each hardened into round beads like black pearls. It pulsed faintly when the treadle was pressed, a sound like breathing slowed against its will. Her eyes moved next to the shelves where small cloth thimbles sat in a neat row, each one stiffened with salt and ash. They were too many, too deliberate, and too small for any sewing hand. They looked instead like coverings, something to seal, not to mend. Near them was a tin of polished river stones, smooth and pale, each no bigger than the inside of a child's cheek. She had seen such stones used to cool swelling, but here they were clean as if scrubbed for display. Ruth's throat tightened. She asked gently about their purpose, and Mercy, with her calm smile, answered in the same tone she used when reciting blessings. Breath lessons, she said, as though the phrase was ordinary, a part of every household, like sweeping the hearth or counting eggs. Ruth said nothing more because the smile that followed was soft and empty. the smile of someone who believed she had spoken of something holy. She glanced toward the inner room, where the sound of shallow coughing reached her ears. The child inside lay pale on a cot, lips stained with something darker than fever, eyes flicking open then shut with each strained inhale. Ruth's hand hovered above her satchel, but she did not reach in. The sight of the bellows lingered in her mind, the resin drip, the stones lined like communion wafers. She thought of the word lessons and knew instinctively that no herb she carried would mend what had been done here. Mercy touched the child's hair, smoothed the linen at his chest, and looked to Ruth as though waiting for her to approve. The silence stretched heavy. Ruth forced a nod, forced her hands to remain folded, forced her eyes away from the rack of thimbles that seemed to watch her. She stayed only a short while, long enough to murmur a prayer, long enough to be seen as a friend who came when called. Then before dusk, she gathered her things, claimed another patient needed her, and stepped back into the open air with relief so sharp it made her dizzy. She walked quickly down the path, bonnet tied too tight, her satchel heavy at her side, though she had not used a single remedy. Behind her, the Walton house sat quiet, smoke curling from its chimney as though nothing were amiss. Neighbors later asked her how the family fared, and she told them only that Mercy kept a good home. She spoke no word of the bellows or the stones, no word of the masks hidden in plain sight. She carried the memory alone, sealed as tight as the thimbles on the shelf, because she knew that even if she told, no one would believe her. Eli Walton was the middle child, a boy who rarely spoke above a whisper and carried himself like someone always waiting for permission. At 12 years old, he had already learned that silence pleased his father and stillness pleased his mother. That winter, Abel decided it was time for Eli to prove himself. The stove burned hot in the parlor, iron doors rattling with the force of the fire, while the front door stood wide open to the snow-swept yard. Abel placed the boy between them, barefoot on the wood floor where the currents of air clashed, heat licking one side of his skin, frost biting the other. He told Eli to stand still, to keep his arms at his sides, and began to count in a calm, steady voice. 1 to 60. Each number dropped like a nail into place, and Eli stared ahead, eyes wide but unmoving as his body shook between fire and ice. His skin flushed red on one side, blue on the other, his breath growing shallow and sharp. But he did not move. Abel's voice carried the weight of command, and Eli understood that movement would mean failure. When 60 came, Abel pressed a hand to his son's shoulder and nodded. Proof had been made. The lesson did not end there. Mercy stepped forward with a small stone polished smooth from the river, pale as bone. She told Eli it was for silence training, her voice kind as if she were offering him a blessing. She set the stone under his tongue and told him to hold it there while he knelt at the hearth. His jaw tightened, drool pooling in his mouth as the stone pressed heavy against his tongue. He swallowed carefully, afraid the rock would slip, afraid to choke, afraid above all to disappoint. Mercy smoothed his hair while she whispered the word still, repeating it until his muscles locked into obedience. The taste of the stone was mineral and strange, the coldness numbing his mouth, but he kept it there until his jaw ached and his throat burned. When he finally removed it, Mercy kissed his brow and placed the stone back into the tin with the others marked now as his. To the Waltons, this was not punishment but proof of order, a way to show the children that breath, body, and will could be bound to rules stronger than hunger or fear. Abel wrote the time in his ledger. Mercy drew a new circle in her book and wrote the word ready beside it. Eli said nothing, but his silence was praised as strength, his endurance treated as devotion. He sat later at the table with lips cracked, cheeks flushed, and hands trembling. But when neighbors asked after the children, Abel called him obedient and Mercy called him blessed. No one knew that the boy had stood between fire and snow until his skin screamed, No one knew that he had knelt with a stone, pressing his tongue into silence until he nearly gagged. To the family, it was only training, only the next step in the calendar already laid out in field and ledger. Eli never spoke of it, never asked why. He accepted it as his place, as the proof of love his parents demanded, and when the next circle was drawn in Mercy's book, the page waited for another child to take their turn. Jonas Hart had spent most of his life walking from homestead to homestead with a cart of polished tin goods, a hammer at his belt, and the reputation of a man who could fix anything with metal and fire. He was not unused to strange requests, pipes bent for secret stills, lanterns altered to burn longer, pots hammered thin for travel. But when Abel Walton approached him with a folded sketch drawn in a carpenter's hand, Jonas hesitated. The drawing showed a bellows larger than any forge would need, rigged with copper valves and a frame of wood that looked less like a tool and more like an organ built for breath. Abel spoke of it calmly, calling it an instrument, a way to measure the rhythm of air the same way a clock measured time. He wanted Jonas to craft the valves and fit the bellows with precision so each push and release would match the fall of liquid from a resin drip. Jonas could not see the use for it, but Abel's steady gaze and measured words pressed against him like weight. Jonas agreed because money was scarce, and because Abel's reputation as a God-fearing carpenter made refusal feel almost insulting. Weeks later, Jonas delivered the finished piece. The bellows were polished smooth, the valves gleaming, the drip tin placed beneath like the heart of the machine. Abel set it upon a wooden frame in his parlor, calling it the clock lung. He demonstrated by pressing the treadle slowly, the valves sighing open and shut, the drip falling from resin heated and cooled until each drop marked a moment. He explained that the device forced a body to match its breathing to the clock, to slow or quicken with its pace. Jonas watched the bellows push air through a narrow pipe and felt his skin prickle. It was not like a forge where fire roared. It was quiet, almost too quiet, like listening to someone die in careful increments. Each drip seemed louder than it should, each hiss of air too controlled. The room held a stillness that pressed against Jonas's chest, making him swallow hard. Abel stood beside the machine with pride, his voice even as he described how it would help discipline the body, how it would teach endurance, how it would bring proof that obedience could be measured. He did not raise his voice, did not show anger, only a calm certainty that left Jonas unsettled. Mercy came in carrying a cloth, her hands folded, her smile gentle. She looked at the clock lung as though it were a cradle rather than a contraption of pipes and breath. Clara lingered in the doorway, ledger in hand, eyes watching with too much focus for a girl her age. Jonas realized then that this machine was not an experiment, not some curiosity. It was already part of the family's order, another piece in a system he could not name but felt in his bones. He left the Walton home with his pay, the weight of coins heavy in his pocket but sour in his stomach. On the road he tried to tell himself it was only a tool, only an eccentric carpenter's device. But the sound of it stayed with him. The drip, the hiss, the pause. It was not the sound of life being sustained. It was the sound of life being controlled. He thought of the pale faces of the children he had glimpsed. Their lips pressed thin, their eyes lowered. He thought of the way Mercy had whispered ready as she folded her cloth. Jonas did not speak of it to anyone, not even his wife. He told himself that silence was safer, that he had only sold tin and air. Yet each night after, when he lay down to sleep, he could hear the rhythm in his head, the slow drip and forced breath, and he knew he had given a family something no home should ever possess. He had sold them a clock that measured not time, but the narrowing of a human chest. Hiram Bell had spent 15 years behind the county desk, his days filled with paper, ink, and the quiet rhythm of names moving through life's records. He filed births in neat columns, recorded marriages with a steady hand, and noted deaths with solemn care. For him, the rolls were not just paper. They were proof that a community lived and endured, a chain of names that gave weight to the passing years. So when the Walton children began vanishing from the school list one after another, always with the same cold word beside them, withdrawn, he felt the tug of something wrong. At first he thought little of it. Families pulled children out of school to help on farms, to tend animals, to weather lean winters. But as months became years, the pattern grew sharp. Withdrawn, always withdrawn, never sick, never dead, never moved away. No funerals were noted in the church record, no bells tolled for their passing. They simply ceased to exist in the public ledger. Hiram was a cautious man, not quick to suspicion, but trained by years of clerking to see the weight of small details others ignored. He asked Abel Walton about it once, catching him at the post road where the carpenter carried a bundle of wood neatly bound. Abel's answer came soft, with the same calm smile he carried to church each Sunday. "The farm keeps them busy," he said, the words smooth as varnish, untroubled as a hymn. Hiram nodded, but something in him recoiled. The way Abel spoke made it sound final, as though busyness was a closing door, not a temporary choice. The children's names, once bright on the rolls, felt as though they had been erased, not set aside. That night Hiram sat at his desk long after the lamps should have been blown out. He opened the school record, tracing the names with a trembling finger. Clara, still present, though pale and quiet in the pews. Eli withdrawn, Samuel withdrawn, Margaret withdrawn. He flipped to the church register. Blank in the space where death notes should have been. The silence on the page was louder than words. Hiram took up his pen and began to write a letter, not to Abel, not to the preacher, but to Magistrate Eliza Morton. He wrote plainly of what he saw. The repeated withdrawals, the absence of funerals, the strange perfection of Abel's field and Mercy's calm face at Sunday service. He did not accuse, for he had no proof, but he asked that eyes greater than his own take note. When the letter was done, he folded it carefully, sealed it with wax, and placed it in his desk rather than the post. He told himself he would send it in the morning. Yet morning came, and he could not bring himself to carry it to town. Something in him feared what might follow, feared the Waltons' smile, feared the quiet strength of their order. Instead, he locked the letter in the bottom drawer, placing it beneath tax rolls where no hand would search. Weeks passed, then months, and still he did not send it. Each time another name disappeared from the school roll, he thought of the letter, thought of opening the drawer, thought of sealing his duty with courage. But his hand always faltered, his silence always returned. He filed everything else with care, but this, the one piece that mattered most, he filed nowhere. In the years that followed, the Walton children continued to vanish from the rolls until only Clara's neat script and pale face remained. The word withdrawn marked their passing as though it were enough, and the records told no truth beyond that. Hiram grew older, his hair graying, his hands shaking, but he never sent the letter. It remained in the locked desk, a silent witness to what he had seen and chosen not to name. He carried the guilt quietly, knowing the ledger he kept so faithfully had been broken, its chain of proof deliberately severed. He told no one, not even his wife, what his drawer held. And when he prayed at night, his words faltered, because deep inside he knew that silence was not safety, it was complicity. Thomas Red was only 19, a lanky boy turning into a man, restless with the boredom of winter nights on his father's farm. He often wandered the fence line to pass the hours, listening to the woods, watching for lantern lights that flickered across the valley. The Waltons' place stood just beyond the ridge, their house always tidy, their fields always lined too neat for comfort. Folks in church said Abel's family was godly, that Mercy kept a good home, that their children were obedient in ways other parents could only envy. Thomas nodded when he heard it, but alone at night he carried his doubts. He had watched the Walton children grow pale, thinner with each season, their voices small, their eyes downcast. He had heard their names vanish from the school rolls, and then, one January night, the sound reached him, the dull, steady rhythm of a shovel biting into frozen earth. At first he thought it was a fox or a deer breaking the crust of snow, but the sound came again and again, too measured, too human. He stepped closer to the ridge, careful not to break a branch beneath his boots, and peered down toward the north field. Lantern light bobbed faintly against the dark, and there he saw Mercy Walton, apron tied tight, carrying folded linens across the yard. She did not move like a woman hanging laundry or bringing bedding inside. She moved with deliberate steps, the cloth tucked close against her chest like an offering. A smaller figure followed her, Clara, the daughter, carrying a tin box. The lid glinted under the lantern, and Thomas could see how carefully she clutched it, as though what lay inside was too precious to spill. The shovel struck again, a muted thud. Abel must have been in the field, though Thomas could not make out his form in the dark. What he did see was the square of earth slowly rising, the neat outline of what the family still called root cellars. His stomach turned cold, though the night air already froze his breath to smoke. He knew a cellar should not be opened at midnight, nor lined with planks that looked too clean to have stored vegetables. He watched Mercy kneel, her hands resting on the folded linens as though in prayer, while Clara placed the tin box at her side. The lantern swayed, the shadows bent, and Thomas turned away before he saw more. His hands shook as he gripped the fence rail, his breath loud in his own ears. He told himself he was imagining, that he had no right to judge another household, that a good neighbor minded his own work. By morning the field was smooth again. The square had been filled, tamped down, a neat patch of earth that gave no hint of what had happened in the dark. Thomas walked past on the road, forcing himself not to stare. Smoke curled from the Walton chimney, and when the breeze shifted, the faint smell reached him. Resin and ash, sharp, unnatural. Not the scent of bread or wood smoke, but of something hardened and burned. He thought of the tin box, of the folded linens, of the careful hands pressing the ground flat. He thought of the children he no longer saw in the yard. That night he told himself again that he must leave it alone. He was 19, untested, and the Waltons were respected. If he spoke, who would believe him? If he accused, who would defend him? Better to let it pass. Better to keep his head down. Yet the sound of that shovel followed him into sleep, the rhythm too steady to forget. In the silence of his bed he heard it still, earth split, earth filled, earth sealed. He buried the memory as neatly as the Waltons buried their root cellars, and like them he prayed no one would ever dig it up again. Brother Asa Pike had ridden the circuit for near 20 years, his sermons delivered in cabins and barns, in fields where families sat on rough benches and bowed their heads as the word was read aloud. He was used to hunger, to hardship, to men whose tempers turned sharp when the bottle was empty, and to women who prayed louder when the graves outnumbered the cradles. What he was not used to was quiet, not the natural quiet of the prairie after dusk, but the kind that lived inside the Walton home the night he took supper there. The house was orderly, every chair in place, every plate set with clean precision. The children sat in a row, hands folded, eyes downcast, their silence unbroken even when the stew steamed and bread filled the table with warmth. Mercy's voice, soft and even, was the only one that sounded beside his own. She passed each bowl with care, and when Asa blessed the food, the Waltons bowed in perfect unison. Heads dipping like clock hands moving together. He thought it remarkable, a sign of discipline that spoke of righteousness. Most households he visited had the noise of life running through them, children fidgeting, a husband interrupting, a wife correcting with a sharp glance. Here there was none of that, only order. Abel Walton spoke little during the meal, but when he did, his words carried weight, spoken in the calm, measured tone of a man certain of his truths. He spoke of obedience, of how the Lord valued not noise but stillness, not rebellion but submission. He spoke of how the soul could be trained just as the body could, and how proof of faith was not in the loudness of prayer but in the silence that followed breath. Asa nodded along, hearing zeal where another ear might have caught something colder. He believed Abel was a man of conviction, a carpenter who had built not only his fences straight but his household as well. After supper, Abel showed him the north field through the parlor window. In the moonlight, the squares of earth lay smooth, each one marked by a stake with a simple symbol cut into its wood. Abel explained them as cellars, storage for roots, a plan for the seasons ahead. Asa admired the foresight, remarking that a wise man prepared for lean times. Abel's smile was thin, and he said only that each square had its purpose, that each space was meant to hold what was appointed to it. Asa, warmed by stew and comforted by the family's calm, took the words as simple thrift, an echo of Scripture about order in the household of God. Before he left, Mercy brought her book from the kitchen and asked the preacher for a blessing upon their home. She held it open not at the front where chores and prayers were listed, but at the back, where circles had been drawn for each moon phase. Asa glanced at the pages, saw the tidy shapes, and thought them marks of a woman tracking seasons. He laid his hand upon the book and prayed for her diligence, for her care, for the discipline of a household that sought righteousness. Mercy bowed her head, her lips curving in a soft smile as his words washed over her. When she lifted her pen later, she added a new circle, darker than the rest, and wrote ready beneath it. Asa Pike rode away into the night, believing he had visited a blessed home, a place where obedience was cherished and order reigned. He told other parishioners in the weeks that followed that the Waltons were an example worth noting, a family whose calm spirit proved the strength of their faith. His words spread trust, not warning, and no one thought to question why the Walton children no longer appeared at school or why their faces grew pale in the pews. The preacher had heard devotion in Abel's calm voice, had seen piety in Mercy's folded hands, and had mistaken silence for grace. He never knew that while he prayed blessing over their discipline, a child upstairs lay with an angel mask stiffening over their face, breath slowed to match the drip of resin. He had the wrong ears, ears that longed to hear zeal and missed the sound of cruelty disguised as care. His blessing lingered in the Walton home like a seal of approval, and Mercy's new circle in her book closed around it, another step in a plan no sermon would ever expose. The storm rolled in without warning. Black clouds dragged low over the prairie, rain slashing sideways against the Walton house until the windows rattled and the shutters beat like fists on the wall. Lightning split the sky, and in the parlor the sound was met with a sharp crack as one of the boards gave way. The nail had long been worked loose by the house's hidden weight, and now it tore free, the plank falling inward to reveal a cavity no guest had ever seen. When the lantern light flared, the hollow was not empty. Inside lay a stack of linen cut into face shapes, stiffened and yellowed, their edges hardened into shells. Angel masks, stored like keepsakes. Beside them were rows of cloth thimbles packed tight in neat bundles, each one gray with salt, each one crusted with ash. Beneath the shelf sat ledgers tied with ribbon, small and worn, their pages bulging as though pressed too often by a careful hand. The storm howled outside, but in that moment the parlor seemed quieter than it ever had, as though the house itself held its breath. Clara was the first to move. She crossed the room, knelt by the fallen board, and gently pressed the masks back into the dark. as if tucking a child to bed. Mercy bent beside her, lifting the ledgers one by one, smoothing their ribbons, whispering the word ready as she placed them back in their place. Abel only stood watching the wall, his jaw tight but his face calm, like a man who accepts a misstep as part of a larger design. He set the plank upright again, driving the nail back in with a single strike. But the wall no longer seemed solid. The storm had opened what was not meant to be opened, and the secret now carried weight beyond the house. Days later, Magistrate Eliza Morton arrived, boots still muddy from the road, after Hiram Bell's long-locked letter finally found its way to her desk. She was a stern woman with a lawyer's eyes, sharp to the quiet places men like to hide. She stood in the Walton parlor, the smell of resin still faint in the air, and asked Abel to show her the field. Abel gave his steady smile, hands folded behind his back, and said the ground was only storage, that a prudent man always planned ahead. His voice carried the calm of scripture, but his words sat uneasily in the room. Eliza's gaze moved to Mercy, who stood silent, and to Clara, who clutched her ledger close to her chest. The storm had passed. The wall had been nailed shut again, but the memory of what had been revealed lingered in the air like damp wood. Outside, the earth of the north field stretched smooth and square, each patch lined like a page turned flat. Rainwater pooled in the soil, seeping into the planks hidden beneath, and the stakes still bore their tiny symbols, moons and numbers cut with quiet hands. Eliza stood at the edge of the first square and did not speak, her silence heavier than accusation. Abel repeated himself, calling it storage, calling it a cellar, his words soft, patient, almost rehearsed. But the storm had already spoken once, and its voice would not be unheard. The morning the magistrate gave the order, the town gathered at the Walton field. Men leaned on shovels, women pressed shawls to their mouths, and children stood in clusters, their eyes wide with the thrill and fear of something forbidden. Eliza Morton's voice was steady as she told the neighbors to dig. Abel stood at the edge of the field, his hands folded behind his back, his expression calm, the faint curve of a smile never leaving his face. Mercy kept her gaze on the ground, and Clara clutched her ledger tight to her chest, as though the book itself might shield her from what was coming. The first spade cut into the earth, and the silence of the crowd thickened. The soil gave way more easily than it should have. Beneath a shallow layer lay planks, smooth and carefully fitted. When they were pried up, the air that rose was not of roots or earth, but of resin and salt. The neighbors drew back, some gagging, some whispering, but Eliza stepped closer, her jaw set. Inside the first pit lay a small body, arranged with deliberate care. The mouth was sewn shut with white thread stiffened by salt, the lips puckered and gray. The tongue had been stained dark as though dipped in ink, and lay still against the teeth. The wrists were bound with braided horsehair, each knot precise as though tied by a craftsman. Beside the body was a small wooden card marked with a carved number and a crescent moon. Gasps broke from the crowd as more pits were opened. Each held the same. A body bent to a rule, bound and sealed in the same manner, each accompanied by its own card. The patterns were too exact to be chance, too methodical to be anything but design. Neighbors turned away, some weeping, some praying under their breath. Mothers clutched their children close, fathers stood rigid, unable to look but unable to walk away. The horror lay not only in the deaths but in the order of them. The way each detail spoke of patience, of intent, of a belief that what had been done was not crime, but ritual. Through it all, Abel kept smiling. His calm face looked almost proud, as if the uncovering of the graves proved what he had always claimed. That order could be made from chaos, that obedience could be carried past breath itself. He did not flinch when the bodies were lifted into the light. He did not lower his eyes when the neighbors recoiled. His smile held as if to say, This is not shame. This is proof. And the town, for the first time, saw what had been hidden in plain sight all along. The weeks after the storm left the Walton farm stripped bare of its disguises, and the town was forced to carry what it had uncovered. The field, once spoken of as a place of plenty, became a place people crossed themselves to avoid. The neat squares, pried open one by one, revealed not root cellars but coffins arranged by design, and the truth was heavier than any soil thrown back into place. Abel and Mercy were taken into custody, but they were not loud in their defense. Abel's words never rose above calm, repeating only that obedience was the truest form of love, that proof of order was worth more than the noise of grief. Mercy held her book when they led her away, her hands clutching the back pages where her circles lay, her eyes lowered as though she were already resigned to what came next. Clara, still a girl, though her face had hardened into something older, was left behind with neighbors who could not look her fully in the eye, for her hands still clutched the ledger that matched the graves. Letters surfaced in the weeks that followed, discovered tucked into drawers and among Abel's carpentry papers. They were not confessions, not apologies, but notes written as if to themselves, instructions in neat cursive. Mercy's hand recorded her belief that care needed proof, that a mother's love was not soft but exact, that silence was safer than chance. She wrote of circles tied to moons, of lessons marked complete when the breath faltered, of a home that stood righteous because no rule went unkept. Abel's letters were sterner, stripped of affection, describing obedience as something that could be taught even when breath grew thin. He wrote of air and order as if they were one, of discipline that bound the soul tighter than flesh, of children not as lives but as proofs, each one a step in a calendar already planned. The townspeople who read them said little, for the words chilled them deeper than the sight of the graves. The letters revealed a mind that had hidden behind politeness, had smiled through sermons and suppers, had cloaked cruelty in the language of devotion. Eliza Morton carried the evidence to the county seat, where lawmakers gathered in a cold room with oil lamps hissing. She laid out the letters, the ledgers, the masks hardened with salt and ash, the horsehair braids and the wooden cards carved with numbers and moons. She did not speak long, for the objects spoke louder than her words. The men who had thought the Waltons a fine example of discipline now sat pale and sweating as they turned over the cards in their hands. They knew the law had left spaces unguarded, places where a family's word was taken as enough, where a death could pass without a witness, where the home was treated as untouchable. The Waltons had not filled that space with chaos, but with something colder. Order without mercy, proof without love. The lawmakers moved quickly. By summer's end, the county passed its rules. No private breath lessons, they declared, though the phrase was spoken with unease as if naming it gave it life. Every death would require 2 non-family witnesses to ensure no child or spouse vanished in silence. Burial cards, once common in some corners, were banned, for the wooden tokens Abel had left in his pits turned the stomach of every man who saw them. The law was written simply, but its weight spread wide. Other counties adopted it, and word traveled through Illinois that what happened at the Walton farm must never happen again. Clerks now recorded deaths with greater care. Magistrates demanded inspections when doubts arose, and midwives whispered warnings when they saw homes too quiet, children too obedient. The town itself raised a memorial. It was not grand, not carved with angels or scripture. It stood by the road where travelers passed, a line of 12 plain stones, each one set upright, each one marked only with a date. No names were written, for names had been erased too long ago, filed away as withdrawn, marked silent in ledgers. The stones became a question more than an answer, each one a weight pressing against the earth to remind those who walked past that order can conceal horror, that silence can strangle as surely as rope. Children dared each other to touch the stones at dusk. Farmers tipped their hats in quiet respect, and mothers drew their children close when the wind carried the smell of resin from the empty field. Clara's ledger remained, pages filled in her neat hand, the columns exact, the circles matched to moons. At the back, among the tallies of masks and the records of breath lessons, there was a space left blank. A 13th square waiting to be filled, never touched by pen or ink. Mercy's circles had stopped short of it, as if she had planned for more but been interrupted before her hand could close the line. Neighbors who saw the page later said the emptiness was worse than the filled ones, for it stood like a promise unfinished, a silence waiting for another breath to be tested. Clara herself clung to the book even as the household collapsed around her. She did not cry in public, did not explain, only held it close as if it were not evidence of cruelty but a map she still believed in. The Walton name was never spoken warmly again, yet their story shaped the county's laws, reshaped how neighbors watched each other, how clerks recorded, how magistrates listened. The town carried scars not written in wounds but in rules, in the knowledge that evil had lived politely among them, smiling across supper tables, nodding in church pews, shaking hands in market stalls. Evil had not shouted or raged. It had whispered, counted, measured, recorded, and smiled. And when the house finally stood empty, the fields untended, the ledgers stored in the county chest, the question remained, heavier than any verdict. What does it mean when care demands proof? When order is praised louder than love? What do we miss when we mistake silence for grace? The 12 stones on the roadside give no answer. They only stand as proof that what was uncovered once can be buried again if vigilance fades. The 13th square waits still, a reminder that the line between devotion and cruelty is thinner than paper, and that one family's lesson can echo into law. The story closes with the weight of that silence, and the voice of the narrator asks what cannot be answered easily. What do you think? Could this happen again?